It's very interesting looking at all these tributes and homages and retrospectives on Lynch. And one of the things that some people are worried about is that everything has been said about him, and broadly, probably correct, that he was in the avant garde, he had a background as a painter, has a very European style, but very distinct American identity. And it's very hard to pin him down to any one genre, although some people try to confine him to the Gothic or even horror or even surrealism. I don't think any of these labels will really capture him completely. But good or bad, people will make these statements that, well, we're done with him. There's really nothing more to say. Or like, well, maybe you're blessed or cursed not to have gone into, as I have, the very, very many books and articles on his work. And to put it mildly, there are many disagreements and many debates. And Lynch himself, whenever he was, I guess reporters want a simplistic answer, he would just be very nice and say, "No, no." Again, the films weren't there to be, well, no nice way of putting it, like McDonald's kids meal. The vast majority of cinema, again, it's not a knock. I'm just being an analyst, are usually genre films. Looking at The Wolfman recently, that's more or less what you're going to get in most films. And even The Wolfman is, quote, trying to be Lynchian and trying to be experimental. And that just wasn't Lynch, really, except for Dune. He never really did Hollywood movies as people conceive them. Like, even with something like The Elephant Man, which is very melodramatic, that's just him taking a story and then injecting his style. There's no doubt that Dune and Elephant Man are his most conventional films. But beyond those two examples, he just really wrote his projects with a lot of help, sometimes code writers, and I would push back on one big myth that it's all original. No, I mean, from my understanding, Wild at Heart is based on a novel. So, yeah, people have this mythology that he just invented it all from his dreams. No, no, he takes a lot from other sources. He's very clear on that. If you go through his interviews carefully, he will say, "Yeah, I was just looking at this or thinking about that," and definitely in some places like not Twin Peaks, the TV show, but the movie has a lot, and I do mean a lot of Kubrick in it. I definitely see a lot of Lolita influences. So if you're patient and want to be either a hardcore specialist or even just a super fan, he will tell you, saying, "Well, yeah, I was thinking through this," and he is very clear on his influences, like his various painters he looks to. Kubrick is a big influence. He's acknowledged a long time, and if you like a lot of classic Hollywood films, that's definitely there, especially Mulholland Drive. That's definitely taking a lot of inspiration from older classical films. So I don't think he's this big mystery box who's impenetrable, but it's a very complex set of worlds, and I'm not even going to try to summarize the insane amount of visions he has. But I would push back on some of the stereotypes that it's all very dark or even a veiled commentary on this and that. It is a commentary, but it's very case by case basis. Definitely certain issues he returned to a lot with families, trauma, especially how children are victimized. There's a lot of that, how innocent victims are just caught up in these bigger conspiracies and really victimized by these larger systems. But even there, Kubrick is much more specific, whereas Lynch is sort of a little bit more vague and also more hopeful than Kubrick. So there's definitely a lot of darkness in his work, but I think people go to that because they just don't want to experience the films. And I'm coming more from a skeptic angle because really until Mulholland Drive, I was sort of aware of who he was, sort of saw his things here and there. I was like, okay, gave it a try. I didn't quite understand why people were going so crazy. In fact, I can remember very distinctly people were doing this interesting horror countdown, and Blue Velvet made the list, and I was like, "Oh, really? Hmm." And so I was always aware of his work, but until Mulholland Drive, I just didn't quite get it. And Siskel and Ebert, who I respected, really hated him. Now, I will say I do think for myself, so I wasn't clear why they hated him so much. It just felt very flimsy. But yeah, now people love him and critics love him. But believe me, back in the 80s and 90s, people were very mixed. I do remember really well, and I don't like this. I'm probably going to do a video on this where Siskel and Ebert just went crazy hating Dune. And definitely the first Dune is, to me, a spectacular film, but it is very flawed. It definitely has major flaws and dilemmas. And Lynch is the first one to tell you that, yeah, there were many parts missing. It was just an overwhelming production, but their criticism was just so superficial. It was just so stupid. So Yeah, it's nice to see him as a critical darling now, but he's been through the ringer. In fact, famously for Lost Highway, he actually put up Siskel and Ebert 2 thumbs down. So he's always had issues with trying to deal with a mainstream audience and mainstream critics. And I'm definitely here highlighting the positive, but he would tell you it was really hard work, even with quote companies that seemingly welcomed him, like Netflix or HBO. You go through the list, he's always had issues with censorship. People don't quite understand what he's up to. Even producers who support him, they've always had doubts about where are we going with this. And it's really interesting looking at the documentaries. He had so many day-to-day problems and creative ways to solve them. I didn't even notice these were problems, but looking back, yeah, Lost Highway, Blue Velvet, and so on and so forth, you will see not flaws, but you'll see like, oh, that's weird. There should be a like something here, but a scene is missing. So it's one of those interesting things that people have this weird daydream about being film directors, and they don't realize it's a very brutally compromising kind of profession. And he's definitely going to stand out as someone who tried not to compromise, but even he had to back off certain things and just rework certain things. I think Mulholland Drive, for instance, was supposed to be a TV show, but it just didn't work. But he still wanted to finish it, and thank goodness, because if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't really have Naomi Watts, who became a superstar after that film. So it's yes, it's a lot of vision, but there is a lot of compromise, and it's interesting whether we'll ever get really the unfiltered version of Lynch. Now that he's dead, it'll probably be a very slow process going through scripts, a lot of unedited things that he left for us. And people have pigeonholed him as a director, which I'm focusing on, but he's much more than a director. He just did so many things: painter, musician. He's really an artist with a capital A in almost every sense of the word. So it's even diminishing him just to focus solely on the films, although that's definitely going to be his major contribution and what most people love or even hate about him. That I've never really bought into that interpretation that the films are themselves so baffling. I think they're fairly straightforward. They're just these very interesting, if strange and disturbing visions where we follow these characters and ideas, and that's it. There are definitely interesting, very specialized mysteries about Twin Peaks or Mulholland Drive's various theories, but like with Mulholland Drive, it just seems what it is. It's an interesting look at the Hollywood dream through these various people whose fantasy we're looking at to me never really mattered. Like, is it really the main character, the main actor? Maybe it's one of the conspirators. Maybe it's the cowboy, so on and so forth. I think those are interesting questions, which you can debate for hours and hours. But I don't think generally the visions were that impenetrable. It just seemed a very interesting perspective, right? Because you could just switch styles so easily from very complex narratives to something like the straight story, which I still haven't seen, but I've seen large chunks of it and a lot of commentaries on it. People just wonder, like, how can he fit all this in one mind or one consciousness? But if you know his stuff at a deeper level, he never had this binary. I mean, he grew up a Christian, but he got into Buddhism later. So it just seems like a weird melding of various religions, artistic styles, different eras, and different traditions. And again, we're just used to film directors being one thing all the time, right? Michael Bay does action, so on and so forth. Steven Spielberg does these big epics, so on and so forth. But the really strong artists aren't ever really one thing. It's not about genre or even style. It's really the perspective they bring. And although sadly we now will not have this perspective, he left us a lot of examples and samples of how and why he visualized and thought about the world. And his family left a very touching thing. Don't concentrate on the whole, but the donut. But I'd probably go bigger and say, don't really think about just the quote darkness or flashy visual style, but just think about the whole thing. And when you look at it, it is a seemingly very strange set of monuments that he left us. But I don't think they're there to be deconstructed or dissected. They're there to be, first of all, experienced. And whether you like them or not, and many people don't like Lynch's films and probably never will, that's perfectly fine. I don't think he had any issue with that. I think people really expect too much of him. I think what he always wanted was people to be honest in their response. And definitely he worked really hard, no doubt about that, to give you a vision. And then if you didn't like the vision or didn't understand it, that's fine. But you respect it as a vision. Whereas, unfortunately, too much of cinema and too many filmmakers are really just always trying to dumb it down into something very simplistic and digestible, and that's just something he was not interested in. Even with Dune, where he felt he did do a lot of compromising, that was not quote, normal to him. He was actually working on a script for a sequel, so his I wouldn't say lying, but being deceptive about how much he hated the film. He loved making it, but it was a very overwhelming process. And so he said, confidentially to a producer, I don't think I want to do this again because it was just too big and too much. So he definitely worked with a quote smaller scale, but even then it was very tough to get financing and get these projects done. So his last official film is Inland Empire, which I've never seen. I've only seen small parts of it, so I want to finally give that a try. But I don't think the point here is to do a binge watch of his quote greatest hits. I think his whole point is if you can try to open your mind and your consciousness seriously to what he's up to, then he'd invite you in. But if you just want to whittle it down to some simple, oh, I like it or don't like it because, I didn't understand the plot, I don't think he had time for that. That's not what the films are for. They're not really about plots or characters. They're about these very, very strange experiences, and then you try and have an honest response with that experience, and then grow from them. If you want to, that's your choice. You don't have to, but they're really more experiences that he tried to give us in cinematic form. And if you look at his other works of art, they're definitely there to be experienced. They're not there to be, quote, just analyzed. That's really not the point. So even though the hallmark of this channel is to analyze, there is also clearly a role for just how you feel or how you intuit what he does with these films. And they definitely leave me confused, but not in the usual sense that I'm cognitively confused, but I'm more confused at a very intriguing angle, especially some different endings that he has to Mulholland Drive. Not like, what does that mean? But it's like, hmm, just a weird merger of styles and what he's trying to produce with that. And definitely, finally, I kind of, as a Hispanic person, I did find it really amusing how much of Spanish culture and Hispanic culture is in Mulholland Drive and how much he had a real affection for foreign languages, foreign styles, but it's always very distinctly American. It's always a very distinctly American dialogue and American perspective and how it tries to absorb these other cultures and commenting on it. So I always appreciated that. And definitely with Mulholland Drive, there's so many mixtures going on. It's pretty crazy. So I can only say give the films a chance, but try to come in there with kind of the right attitude and don't expect them to be, these kind of kids meals or burgers that you just digest and get rid of and that's it. And that's all there is to it. They're definitely there to leave an impression. You don't have to let the films leave an impression, but that's what he wanted. And hopefully that's what we'll be getting from people who are inspired by his work. And I humbly say I'm one of those people, but it's definitely going to be hard to match the sheer power of what he gave us, but we can at least give it a try.